On March 29th, 2002, Starter Deck Yugi and Starter Deck Kaiba were released in the TCG. These products were pre-made decks themed around the two main characters of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TV series. The new cards introduced in these decks changed the game completely, introducing powerful tools to combat the incredibly powerful Exodia strategy. The set also contained a monster that would come to change the way the game was played. Wait, what's that card doing here? I'm talking about. Welcome to YGO from Zero, your source for exhaustive guides to Yu-Gi-Oh's past formats. While LOB format's simple card pool led to a relatively simple format dominated by Exodia, SDYK format's new cards make it a much more interesting and complex format. But before diving into all that, there are some cards that introduce some new rules into the game, so let's discuss those first. The first and most important new rule that I want to talk about comes with effects that can actually activate during the damage step. So in the last guide, I said that in the battle phase, trap cards cannot be activated during the damage step, but this isn't quite true. Traps that directly modify the attack or defense of a monster can actually be activated in the damage step before damage is calculated. So, for instance, in this case, if this Battle Ox attacks this Lodge-In, and it gets to the damage step, we can activate Reinforcements, boosting the Battle Ox's attack over the Lodge-In. And our opponent can't activate a card like Waboku, which does not modify the attack or defense of their monster, to protect their Lodge-In. So the Battle Ox will be able to actually win this battle. And this is an incredibly important interaction that can happen during games, and it's part of what makes Reinforcements a pretty powerful trap. But we'll get into that a bit later. I want to show one more example of this happening, just to sort of show when exactly you can activate cards that affect the attack and defense of monsters in the damage step. So, let's say our Lodge-In is attacking our opponent's Giant Soldier of Stone. The Lodge-In will attack, and the Giant Soldier of Stone gets flipped up before damage is calculated. At this point, effects that modify attack and defense can be activated, so you don't have to fire off our reinforcements prematurely before you've seen what your opponent's monster is. So you can activate it at this point once you know that it's a Giant Soldier of Stone. And the opponent can actually chain a effect to it that also modifies the attack or defense of a monster, like Castle Walls. I just wanted to show this off to just really nail down when exactly this happens in the damage step. Now the next rulings that I want to discuss concern the trap card Ultimate Offering. There was a continuous trap in the last set in the form of Dragon Capture Jar, but Ultimate Offering differs in one key regard, and that's that Ultimate Offering has an effect that you can activate while it's face up on the field. This effect can generally be activated whenever you could normally activate a trap card, as long as it's in the correct phase to do so, because Ultimate Offering says that it can only be used during the main phase or the opponent's battle phase. You can activate the continuous trap itself during any phase when you could normally activate a continuous trap, however. But, as a note, when you're first activating Ultimate Offering, you cannot chain its activated effect to the actual activation of the trap. Now, I know that may sound confusing, but hopefully this example will make it clear what that means. Let's say that our opponent has a Trap Master face down, which is a monster that can destroy a trap on the field once it's flipped face up. And let's say we activate Swords Revealing Light, flipping up the Trap Master. So this Trap Master will flip up and be able to target our Ultimate Offering and destroy it. Now, we can chain the activation of Ultimate Offering to the Trap Master effect to flip up the Ultimate Offering, but unfortunately for us, the Trap Master will destroy the Ultimate Offering in that chain, and we won't be able to actually use the effect of Ultimate Offering to summon out a monster from our hand. This is a very niche interaction in this format that doesn't really come up that often, but I think it's good to know about in general, and it will become more important in the future. The next rule that I wanted to discuss about Ultimate Offering isn't really a new rule, but more an application of an old rule. So you can chain the effect of Ultimate Offering to itself, because there's no restriction on how many times you can activate Ultimate Offering in one turn. So you could activate the effect of Ultimate Offering to summon a monster, and then chain its effect to summon a monster to itself, thus being able to summon two monsters in one chain. Now, I talked about how chains actually resolve in the last guide. So what will happen is if there are no responses to this, then the chain will resolve backwards from chain link 2. So the first effect of Ultimate Offering will activate, letting us normal summon a monster. And then the second effect of Ultimate Offering will also activate, letting us normal summon another monster. If our opponent has a trap hole face down that they want to activate, they will only be able to activate it and destroy the second monster that we brought out, because you can't activate other cards while a chain is resolving. So they wouldn't be able to activate the trap hole when our first summon occurred. Thus, they'll only be able to activate Trap Hole on the last summon that occurred. And since Trap Hole says when your opponent normal summon or flip summons a monster with yada yada yada, it can't actually destroy a monster that was summoned previously in the chain, because it can only destroy the monster that was summoned when it's activated. So this isn't really a new rule, but it is a very useful application of Ultimate Offering if you are trying to protect the first monster that you're summoning out. This next ruling is related to the new spell card Destruction. Card Destruction reads that both players discard as many cards as possible from their hand, and then each player draws the same number of cards that they discarded. So you might wonder if you could activate this card when a player has more cards in their hand than remain in their deck. For instance, our opponent has 3 cards in hand and only 2 cards in deck. So you might think that we might not be able to activate Card Destruction. And while this is true in some future formats of the game, in this format, you can actually activate Card Destruction when a player has more cards in hand than in deck. And what will happen is both players will discard their hands and attempt to draw as many cards as they can from their deck, such that they draw the same number of cards that were in their hand. But in the case of our opponent here, they will be unable to draw to the full amount that they would have to draw, and thus they will lose to deck out. Because deck out occurs whenever a player needs to draw a card, but cannot. This may seem like a pretty niche rule, but it actually is important for one of the decks that I'll discuss later in the video, so I thought that I'd bring it up now. As a cautionary note, this rule also applies to the player who plays Card Destruction. So if you activate Card Destruction when you yourself have more cards in your hand than remain in your deck, you will lose the game. So just something to keep an eye out for. Okay, the last new rule that I want to talk about is extremely niche, but it can come up, so I just want to put this rule out there for the record. Let's say that our opponent has a Wicked Worm Beast set face down, and we have a Change of Heart. We activate the Change of Heart, taking their Wicked Worm Beast, and then we flip it face up. Then we could attack or do whatever we want with this, but let's say that our Wicked Worm Beast is still around at the end phase of the turn. Now, Change of Heart and Wicked Worm Beast both have effects that do something during the end phase. So Change of Heart says that you take control of the monster until the end phase, so thus, at the end of the turn, Change of Heart returns the monster to your opponent's control, and Wicked Worm Beast says that at the end of your turn, it returns to its owner's hand. So, you might be wondering what happens in this situation where both effects activate at the same time. Well, in cases like this, The player whose effects are activating at the same time can actually choose the order in which they activate. So they can choose to either first return the Wicked Worm Beast to their opponent's control, or they can choose to use the Wicked Worm Beast's effect to return it to the owner's hand. The reason why this matters is that this will actually make two different board states. If you activate the Wicked Worm Beast effect first, then the Wicked Worm Beast will return to the opponent's hand and Change of Heart will have nothing to do. If you activate Change of Heart's effect first, then the Wicked Worm Beast will return to your opponent's control. Since the Wicked Worm Beast says that it returns to the owner's hand during the end phase of your turn, the Wicked Worm Beast will not actually return to the opponent's hand in this case, because it's not their turn. The your turn only applies to the person who controls the Wicked Worm Beast. So, this can result in two different game states. One where the Wicked Worm Beast is under our opponent's control, and the other in which the Wicked Worm Beast is in our opponent's hand. So, of course, the advantageous thing to do is to activate the Wicked Worm Beast first, return it to the hand, and deprive our opponent of a monster. This situation won't really come up much in this format, as there are very few sorts of situations where multiple effects will be activating at the same time like this. But it can happen in some cases, especially since the Wicked Worm Beast is such a prevalent card, as I'll discuss later. So I figured that I'd discuss it here. But this is the last new rule that I wanted to discuss, so let's dive right into the new cards. Okay, now that we've discussed the new rules that some of these cards bring to the format, let's discuss the cards themselves. Of course, we have to start with the monsters, as always, and this set had some pretty important monsters that shake up the game quite a bit. Let's first start with the classic 4-star beaters. Now, last format, we had a class of monsters called 4-star beaters, which were basically the level 4 monsters with the highest amount of attack. In LOB format, the monster with the highest amount of attack was Skull Redbird, so that was the real dominant and aggressive threat. However, Starter Decks Yugi and Kaiba released some monsters with attack points that outclassed Skull Redbird by quite a bit. First and foremost is La Jin, the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, which is the monster with the highest amount of attack on a level 4 monster at 1800 attack. It is closely followed by Battleox and Neo the Magic Swordsman, both at 1700 attack. Now, in the last format, we had a similar case where there were two monsters with the same amount of high attack, and we kind of had to decide between the two which ones we wanted to put in our deck. And in that case, the Witty Phantom outclassed Celtic Guardian because it had 1300 defense as opposed to 1200 defense. In this format, we don't have this issue. Battleox and Neo the Magic Swordsman both have 1700 attack and 1000 defense. So really, there's no clear choice as to which is strictly better. I do prefer Battleox very slightly, because there are some tribal strategies playing field spells to pump up Battleox over La Jin with things like Forest or Wasteland, because Battleox is a beast warrior, whereas a tribal strategy playing a field spell to pump up Neo the Magic Swordsman would be playing Yami, which would buff both Neo and La Jin, so that's not really a viable strategy. Thus, I prefer Battleox just because occasionally in those niche matchups, it can be slightly more advantageous than Neo. But realistically, if you want to max out on beaters, you can honestly play 3 copies of all of these in your deck. And so generally it won't come up. But that's something to consider if you are choosing between these two. Not that I think it matters. You can just go based on personal preference pretty much all the time. Now we get to my favorite new monster in the format, and that's the Wicked Worm Beast. Now, upon first reading, this card seems really bad. First of all, it only has 1400 attack, which is worse than even the big beaters from last format. A Skull Redbird can get over a Wicked Worm Beast. Secondly, it has the effect that this face-up card on the field is returned to the owner's hand during the end phase of your turn. And this seems like a terrible effect. why would you summon a monster that doesn't actually maintain your board presence, right? Don't you want to summon out monsters that will stick around on the field to be able to attack your opponent on later turns and potentially protect your life points from your opponent's attacks? Well, normally this would be the case, but given the vast amount of removal in this format, the Wicked Wormbeast's effect is actually a benefit and not a downside. The Wicked Wormbeast is one of the only monsters that will actually be able to quote-unquote stick around, not necessarily on the field, but in your hand. And if you can summon out the Wicked Wormbeast every turn and use removal to clear your opponent's board every turn, then you can just keep getting in for damage and preserve your own resources. So the Wicked Wormbeast is actually incredibly good. I think that it is a must include in pretty much every aggro deck, although there are some aggro decks that don't really want to use it, and I think that those aggro decks are worse than aggro decks built around the Wicked Wormbeast. But we'll get to all that when we discuss the aggro strategies later in the video. Moving on from the really offensive monsters, we now move on to the defenders. Now, of course, the 2K defenders from last set are all very good, especially since there are no level 4 lower monsters with higher defense than 2000. So Giant Soldier Stone, Aquamador, Spirit of the Harp, and Mystical Elf are all still the premier defenders in terms of defense alone. This set actually did introduce a new defender, however, that may have an additional benefit for you, and that's Wall of Illusion. Now, Wall of Illusion only has 1850 defense as opposed to the other monster's 2000 defense, but it has an effect that the other monsters don't. Its effect reads that if this monster is attacked, after damage calculation, return that monster to the hand. So what exactly does this mean? Well, this monster can still be destroyed by battle by something like a Summoned Skull that has more attack than it, but after that battle concludes, the monster that destroyed it will return to the hand. And even if a monster doesn't return it, whatever attacks it will return to the owner's hand. Now, this may seem like a strict improvement to the 2K defenders, especially since not even the highest attack on a level 4 beat stick can get over the 1850 defense that Wall of Illusion has. However, in a lot of cases, the effect on Wall of Illusion is a bit of a downside. As I mentioned with the Wicked Wormbeast, if a card sticks around in your opponent's hand, then you won't be able to use removal on it. And that will let your opponent keep a resource that you could have otherwise deprived them of. So, Wall of Illusion isn't actually the best in a lot of situations. That being said, there are some decks that do value its effect very highly, and I'll discuss those decks later. So, I don't think Wall of Illusion is necessarily better or worse than the regular 2K defenders, I just think it's deck dependent. And it's a very good card to keep in mind when you're attacking into a set monster in this format. Of course, Maneater Bug is still pretty good in terms of removing our opponent's monsters. However, it is a bit worse in this format due to the introduction of a spell called Change of Heart, which I'll discuss later. But Change of Heart can let our opponent take control of our Maneater Bug, flip it up, destroy itself, and you've just lost your Maneater Bug. Sure, it's traded with an opponent's card, but compared to another defender being taken with Change of Heart, like if Giant Soldier of Stone was taken with Change of Heart, at least you'll get back that Giant Soldier of Stone in the end phase of your opponent's turn. So Maneater Bug is a bit less good due to Change of Heart. That's not to say that it's terrible. If your opponent doesn't have Change of Heart, it's still as good as always. And also in conjunction with another powerful card that I'll talk about later, Ultimate Offering, it is still extremely, extremely good. But in general, it's not the must include that it was in LOB format. There's another flip monster in this set that I want to talk about, and that's Trapmaster. Now, Trapmaster has a flip effect that when flip face up, you select one trap card on the field and destroy it. So it's basically Armed Ninja, but for trap cards. This may seem pretty good because it can get rid of your opponent's trap holes, or even any of the newer traps that are introduced in this format that are all very powerful. However, I don't actually think this card is very good, because, like I mentioned with Man-Eater Bug, Change of Heart exists in this format at 3 copies. This means that your opponent can take your face-down Trap Master and actually use it to destroy your own trap cards. This is an incredibly punishing move if your opponent manages to pull it off, because they're essentially using 1 resource to deprive you of 2, your Trap Master's effect and whatever trap you get rid of. So, I do think that while there are some very powerful traps in this format, Trap Master is not very good, and that there are actually some better options, which I'll discuss later. But I want to mention this here just because it does seem like a good card, but I don't think it is. I just wanted to mention Trap Master here, just like I mentioned Hane in the last format guide, as a card that seems very tempting to use, but is actually pretty bad. The last of the new notable monsters in this set is Summon Skull. Summon Skull is a level 6 monster with 2500 attack, and you might remember in the last format guide, I mentioned that tribute monsters are all pretty bad, mainly because the highest attack on a 1 tribute monster couldn't get over the highest defense on a level 4 lower defender. Summon Skull rectifies this issue. Summon Skull can get over things like Giant Soldier of Stone, Aquamador, and all the other 2k defenders. It can even get over a Wall of Illusion, although getting over a Wall of Illusion with the Summon Skull is a bit rough because you've already used a resource to get the Summon Skull out on the field, and this is just depriving you of that resource. Summon Skull also gets a little bit better in conjunction with Change of Heart, which can be used to take one of your opponent's monsters that you can then use to tribute off for Summon Skull. So, Summon Skull is a pretty decent card in this format, and you can actually build aggro decks with it in mind. And I will actually discuss an aggro deck built around Summon Skull and Change of Heart later in the video. It's just, I don't think that that deck is necessarily better than the Wicked Wormbeast decks. Moving on to the important spell cards in this format, we first have all the previous format staples that were in LOB. So, Pot of Greed, Raigeki, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Sword of Revealing Light, all still incredibly powerful cards that pretty much every deck should run if it aligns with their game plan. I feel like I don't really have to dive into what makes these cards great, as it pretty much hasn't changed. However, I will say one thing about Monster Reborn, in that Monster Reborn can actually be used to great effect to get back your Wicked Wormbeasts that have been destroyed by your opponent's cards. Just letting you get back a resource that returns to your hand, it's very good. So Monster Reborn actually improves a little bit in this format. Unfortunately, a past format staple that I think just doesn't quite cut it anymore is Fissure. Now, I don't think Fissure's a bad card by any stretch, and I even think that some decks can include it if they want to. I just think that compared to all the other power spells in this format and all the other powerful cards in this format, Fissure just doesn't quite cut the mustard anymore. And the same thing applies to Stop Defense, except to a much more extreme degree, because I think Stop Defense is just incredibly bad in this format, and I don't even think it should be included in any deck, even in the side deck against decks that play a lot of defense. So these two, sort of format staples from the last format, I think are not very good anymore, although I do think Fissure is a bit more viable than Stop Defense and can see inclusion in some decks. Getting to the new spells now, we first have Change of Heart. Change of Heart's an incredibly powerful card that can be used in many different contexts. It says target one monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase. Now, you can do whatever you want basically with that new monster. You can use it as tribute fodder for Summon Skull, essentially turning Change of Heart into a removal spell. You can use it to attack your opponent's life points directly to just get in a bit more damage. You can use it to use up one of their flip effects on like a Maneater Bug or a Trap Master. It's just an incredibly versatile card that applies in a lot of different scenarios, and it's extremely, extremely good. And it can also act essentially as one-turn removal. If your opponent has a defender that you can't get over, you can always change of heart, take the defender to your side of the field, and attack your opponent directly now that they don't have a monster. So, Change of Heart is an incredibly, incredibly good card, and I recommend that pretty much every deck should play it. And definitely every aggro deck. Now we get into a set of spells that I think the last format really, really needed given what the dominant strategies were. And these are basically anti-stall or anti-Exodia spells. De-spell is the big one. Target one face-up spell or one set or trap card on the field and destroy it if it's a spell card. Now, this is incredibly, incredibly good at two things. One, getting rid of your opponent's set bluffs. So if your opponent is trying to bluff that they have like a Trap Hole or Waboku with one of their powerful spells, and you have the read that that's the case, you can activate De-spell, destroy their set card, and deprive them of a powerful resource. More importantly, however, is the second use of this card. It can be used to get rid of a Sword's Revealing Light before the swords would naturally expire. Now, this can be an incredibly, incredibly important thing to do. Just deprive your opponent of safety when they most desperately need it. And this can be great both against aggro decks that are playing Sword's Revealing Light just to draw a bit more cards, and more importantly, against stall decks that rely on Sword's Revealing Light to slow down the game so that they can get to their win condition sooner. De-spell also pretty much just power creeps Armed Ninja out of the game, which means that Armed Ninja is basically now an inferior version of De-spell, because Armed Ninja does require you to use up your normal summoner set to set it face down on the field, and then you have to hope that your opponent won't actually remove it with something like a Dark Hole or Raigeki. So De-spell doesn't have these flaws. De-spells you can activate immediately from your hand, clearing the swords without having to put any setup into it. And this makes it just an incredibly, incredibly useful card that I think honestly could deserve at least one spot in the main deck, but should definitely be at 3 copies among the main and side deck, just in case you're going up against a stall strategy. The other spell in the set that's really, really targeted against Exodia is Card Destruction. Card Destruction reads that both players discard their entire hands and then draw the same amount of cards from their deck. Now, I don't necessarily think that this justifies an inclusion in the main deck unless you're really, really worried about Exodia, because against decks that aren't Exodia, this card can be pretty bad. But against Exodia decks, this card can be incredibly, incredibly powerful as it can discard their pieces. And if an Exodia deck discards all 3 of one given piece, then they basically lose their win condition entirely. So I definitely think this is a very, very good card to put in the side deck if you're anticipating facing Exodia. It also is the backbone of a very powerful stall strategy in and of itself, but I will get to that later. Moving on to the traps, we first have Trap Hole. Trap Hole, last format staple trap, still very, very good in this format. One of the only ways to deal with the Wicked Worm Beast, and for that reason it's incredibly powerful. Now we move on to the new traps. Firstly, we have Reinforcements. Reinforcements is a pretty good trap for any aggro deck that's going really all in on their beaters, because Reinforcements enables any 4-star beater to get over any 2k defender. So, for that reason, Reinforcements is very good. It can also dodge around things like Waboku, which I'll talk about later, because of the rule that it can be activated in the damage step, while other cards like Waboku cannot. So, Reinforcements has a lot of very cool applications in an aggressive strategy, and should definitely be considered in a deck that's planning on going aggro. The 2 other traps I want to talk about, though, are much, much more powerful than Reinforcements, and are honestly some of the most powerful cards in the set. The first of which is Waboku. Now, Waboku reads that you take no battle damage this turn, and your monsters cannot be destroyed by battle this turn. While the second effect does occasionally come up, it's the first effect that is really, really important. Waboku can basically prevent your opponent's big offensive pushes from outright killing you, or making a major dent in your life points. This means that going all in on an offensive push at the end of the game can actually backfire immensely if your opponent has a Waboku, because of the prevalence of so many board clears in the game. You could just lose all the monsters you put onto the field to make that offensive push. So Waboku really changes the way the game is played, especially considering how last format you could really go all in at the end of a game, just playing all your monster reborns, clearing your opponent's field, and just attacking in for game with the assurance that your attacks would connect. Waboku really changes that, and in doing so, changes the nature of these games, which is really, really cool. The last trap that I want to talk about is also very, very format warping, and that's Ultimate Offering. Now, Ultimate Offering is a bit of a confusing continuous trap, and I talked about some of the rules surrounding it in the rules section of this video. So if you are confused by it, be sure to check that out. But basically what Ultimate Offering does is it lets you perform extra normal summons or sets during your main phase or your opponent's battle phase. You do have to pay a cost of 500 life points to do this, but most of the times this cost is very well worth it. Ultimate Offering can be used to make incredibly devastating offensive pushes. If your opponent has a clear field and you have a bunch of monsters in hand, you can use Ultimate Offering to summon them all out and attack in for a lot of damage. But more importantly, in my opinion, Ultimate Offering also has incredible defensive capabilities. If you want to protect your life points with a defender, then if you set it on your turn, your opponent can always use removal to clear it away and then summon a monster and attack for damage in the battle phase. Ultimate Offering lets you get around this by letting you set monsters from your hand during the battle phase to prevent your opponent from getting in with big damage. It can also let you bring out monsters like Mania Bug in the battle phase to make sure that Mania Bug's effect will likely go off, because your opponent will probably keep attacking into it, and you will be able to destroy one of your opponent's monsters with the Mania Bug. It's just a very good card at being able to dodge removal, and any card that dodges removal in this format is worth considering playing in your deck. Now that I've finished covering the cards that I think are just generally good and generally good to keep in mind, let's start discussing the actual decks in the format. Starting, of course, just like last time, with the aggro strategies. Now, the first aggro deck that I want to talk about is one built around the Wicked Wormbeast. Now, there are two main directions that you can go in building an aggro deck around this card, and I will talk about the other one later. But the first one I want to focus on is just going, foot on the gas all the way aggro. So the goal of this deck is to just keep up the offensive pressure on your opponent at all times. The main way to do this is by using the Wicked Wormbeast and some form of removal to get in for a consistent 1400 damage every turn. But the deck is also playing a bunch of level 4 lower beaters to deal with our opponent's offensive threats and just deal with other cards that may come up, and just to put on the offensive pressure as well. So let's dive in to the deck breakdown. We of course have 3 Wicked Wormbeast. You really want to see this card at some point in the game, because once it's in your hand, you've just got an incredible amount of resources going at all times, because you just get it back at the end of every turn, and your opponent can't get rid of it very easily. So very, very good, the backbone of the deck. We, of course, have all our level 4 beaters. As I mentioned, they're very good at dealing with some of our opponent's offensive threats, as well as putting on some more offensive pressure. For the spells, we, of course, have all our removal spells, Dark Holes, Raigekis. We don't have any Fissures in the main deck, because there are just too many other good cards that need to be in the main deck instead, in my opinion. So instead, we have a couple different things. We have 3 Change of Hearts, which, while they generally don't destroy our opponent's monsters, they really do help maintain offensive pressure if we can take our opponent's monster, summon a Wicked Worm Beast, get in for a lot more damage than we would otherwise. So Change of Heart is very useful at doing that, and it's also good at using up our opponent's flip monsters if they're playing any of them. We also have Reinforcements that can sort of serve the role that Fisher would normally serve, because Reinforcements can let our level 4 or lower beaters attack over our opponent's offensive threats or our opponent's defenders. So it's essentially a Fisher that does need a monster to work, but it will let us get over things that Fisher won't in the battle phase. And it also is not that big of a risk when we're playing so many monsters in our deck. So Reinforcements is basically like a pseudo Fisher, but a bit better for our purposes. We also have 3 Monster Reborns. These can be used to get out your big offensive threats back from the graveyard, like Lodgin, but the general best way to use Monster Reborn in this deck is to get back a Wicked Worm Beast that your opponent managed to trap whole or Maneater Bug or get rid of in some way, because this means that you'll get back that resource and you'll have it for later turns. So Monster Reborn plus Wicked Worm Beast is incredibly strong. We of course have our 3 Pot of Greeds just to draw deeper, and we have 3 Swords Revealing Light to potentially stall our opponent while we draw some of the pieces that we need, or just to see what monsters they're playing to flip those up. It is a very, very good card. Even though Dispel is in the format, it can just really slow down our opponent's momentum and allow us to get back in the game a bit. Speaking of Dispel, we have 1 copy of Dispel to keep on that offensive pressure. If our opponent plays his swords because they're desperate, we can play a Dispel, clear their swords, and keep attacking in. Now, I only have 1 copy in the main deck because I think that there are some other cards that are just better to include. But I could see bumping this up to 2 copies if you really want it, and maybe cutting something like an Ultimate Offering. Speaking of Ultimate Offering, let's get into the traps. I already talked about the Reinforcements, but we're also playing 3 Trap Holes. Great way to clear the board to get your Wicked Worm Beast in. It's also just, you know, it's a great card all around. It can be used defensively to protect your life points. It's still one of the best traps in the format. We also have 3 Waboku just to prevent our opponent's offensive pushes and to occasionally protect our monsters. Waboku, I think, is basically an auto-inclusion in any deck in this format at 3 copies, just because it can keep you alive in a lot of situations, and it has a bunch of different uses, and it's very, very good. We also have 1 copy of Ultimate Offering. Now, I could see either cutting this copy entirely or bumping it up to a couple more copies, but the reasoning behind this is we don't want to draw multiple copies of this, because multiple copies of it don't really do anything, and it's just kind of a dead card in our hand. And this deck doesn't really require Ultimate Offering. Generally, just having removal and a Wicked Worm Beast every turn is good enough. But Ultimate Offering can be used for major offensive pushes. It can also be used to summon out a Lodgin during our opponent's battle phase to potentially block one of their attacks, although that's not necessarily the best move. But it is a very versatile card, and especially with Wicked Worm Beast, it enables you to potentially get in a bit more damage each turn if you normal summon a regular beater and then use Ultimate Offering to normal summon a Wicked Worm Beast as well. That way you're not committing too much to the board, but you are increasing the offensive pressure on your opponent, and that can be very good. Now that we've covered all the cards in the main deck, let's dive into the side deck. The main thing that we're worried about here is the Exodia matchup. And to that end, we have 3 Card Destruction, we have 2 Dispel, and we have 3 Remove Trap. Remove Trap is the alternative to Trap Master that I was mentioning earlier, And I think it's incredibly, incredibly good because the trap that you really want to get rid of in this format is Ultimate Offering. So if you're playing 3 remove trap, you can get rid of your opponent's Ultimate Offering, which is an incredibly powerful card in any stall deck because it lets them dodge around your removal for the most part. And it's just very, very good. The card destructions, of course, really mess up an Exodia's strategy because it could cause them to lose all their pieces. And the D-spells, of course, are very good against Swords Revealing Light. We also have an additional beater if we want to get a bit more aggressive in the form of Great White. I didn't talk about the next highest attack on a beater in my core cards sort of introduction, but the next highest attack on a beater is 1600. This attack stat is shared by a couple monsters in this format. It's shared by Great White, it's shared by Rogue Doll, and shared by Ryukishin Powered. And it's also shared by Man-Eating Treasure Chest. Now, the reason I put Great White in the side deck here instead of one of those monsters is purely because if your opponent's playing a niche sort of tribal strategy, kind of like Sogen Aggro in the last format, they could be playing Umi Aggro. I don't think it's very good, but Umi plus Great White turns it into effectively a La Jin, and most decks aren't playing main deck Great Whites, so that is a deck that your opponent could reasonably make. It's not a very good deck. I think it's actually a pretty bad deck, but you're less likely to run into Yami Tribal than Umi Tribal, even though you're not really likely to run into either. So that's why I went Great White instead of the others. Realistically, I don't think it matters which 1600 attack point beater you put in this slot, or realistically, you could even put in something like an additional Fisher. I honestly don't think it matters that much, but if you want to get more aggressive with the beaters, here's a Great White. Also, in matchups against slower decks, a Summon Skull can be good to combo with your Change of Heart. I think in most games against a stally sort of deck, it's not going to necessarily pay off, but there are instances where you'd want this. So that's why there are 2 in the side deck. And in addition, we also have additional copies of Fisher and Reinforcements for those slower matchups where you want to get over a bunch of your opponent's defenders. And we also have 2 Ultimate Offerings in case we want to get even more aggressive with our offensive pushes. I think in general, these cards are the least useful cards in the side, but they can come up. So it's good to have them just in case, and there aren't really many other better options in the side deck. So this is the sort of aggressive version of the Worm Aggro deck, and I think it is one of the best sort of decks in the format. It's just incredibly powerful at forcing your opponent to play defensively against all your offensive monsters, but also being able to maintain resources with the Wicked Worm Beast. So I think it's very good, but there is another direction you can go with a Wicked Worm Beast deck that I think is also extremely good, but has a vastly different playstyle. The other direction that you can go with a Wicked Worm Beast deck is what I like to call Worm Reaction. So the goal of this deck isn't necessarily to constantly be putting offensive pressure on your opponent. The goal of this deck is to consistently clear away your opponent's board to get in with the Wicked Worm Beast. Of course, part of the way this happens is, of course, through the regular removal spells, but also through leveraging Ultimate Offering combined with some very powerful defensive tools like Man-Eater Bug and Wall of Illusion. I think this deck's really cool, so let's just go into the deck breakdown right away. We, of course, have 3 Wicked Worm Beast, the all-star of the format, just incredibly good at letting you keep your resources throughout the game. We have some level 4 beaters to put on some offensive pressure if we need it. So we've chosen to go with 3 La Jin and 1 Battle Ox. Again, I prefer Battle Ox over Neo because of the reasons I mentioned in the core card section, but I honestly think this could be Neo if you prefer. I don't think it matters that much. What matters is that we have another 1700 beater. And then we have 3 Man-Eater Bug and 3 Wall of Illusion. Now, These cards are not generally supposed to be used in the way that you normally use them in like the last format, in that you're not trying to set these cards on your turn. You're actually trying to set these cards on your opponent's turn during their battle phase using Ultimate Offering. Ultimate Offering is one of the other backbones of this deck, and so we are playing it at 3 copies, and the goal is to have an empty board at the end of our turn with Ultimate Offering. If our opponent summons out a monster and attacks in, we set a Man-Eater Bug or a Wall of Illusion. If they continue to attack that monster, then we can get their monster out of the way, either returning it to the hand with Wall of Illusion or destroying it with Man-Eater Bug, and then we can summon out a Wicked Worm Beast on our next turn to get in for a little bit more damage. Now, you could potentially play Hane here instead of the Wall of Illusion, because if your opponent just stops attacking when they see that you've set a monster, then you won't be able to return that monster to the hand with Wall of Illusion. But the reason I like Wall of Illusion a little bit better is because your opponent will likely keep attacking, because in the case that it's a Man-Eater Bug, you'll be able to use its effect anyways, and they don't want you to get an additional monster on the field. So I think that they're most likely going to continue attacking into your set monster. And in the case that it is Wall of Illusion, you will be able to turn that to attack position to get in for a little bit more damage on the next turn. So I like Wall of Illusion a little bit better than Hane in this situation, but I think that Hane is also a respectable choice instead of Wall of Illusion. Wall of Illusion can also help you out in cases that you don't have the key pieces of your setup and you want to play defensively. Wall of Illusion can potentially last for a little bit longer than a Hane can, although with all the removal in this format, it is a bit unlikely. So you really want to be playing these cards with the Ultimate Offerings, and you don't want to just set them on their own, although you definitely can. Moving on to the spells, we of course have our standard removal spells, the Dark Holes, the Raigekis, and the Change of Hearts, which are pretty much pseudo removal. We also have the Pot of Greeds to draw deeper into our deck. We have Monster Reborns, mainly to bring back the Wicked Worm Beast and just keep that advantage going. And we have 3 Swords of Revealing Light to stall our opponents for a bit. Now, we don't actually run Dispel in this deck because this deck isn't meant to sort of be completely aggressive at all times. It's more meant to be sort of controlling. So we chose not to run a Dispel in the main deck, unlike the aggressive version of this build, but I think that is for the best. But if you're someone who wants to have the Dispel just to keep the offensive pressure going in cases where our opponents do have swords, then I think that's a respectable inclusion. I think this format had a lot more flexibility in what exactly you want to include in your main deck and with how many copies. And I think that you can really tailor it to exactly how you want to play. Moving on to the traps, we have our 3 trap holes. This is removal on our opponent's turn, and it clears the way for our Wicked Worm Beast to attack in. We have 3 Ultimate Offerings. I've already explained this is the backbone of the deck. You always want to draw this. Drawing multiple copies can be annoying, but it can also be useful in games where your opponent does have remove traps, like games 2 and 3 of this sort of matchup. But this is a card that you always want to see at some point in the game. And then we have 3 Wabokus. Yeah, I can't say enough about this card. It's just incredibly, incredibly good. One of the most powerful cards in the set to just prevent your opponent from making huge offensive pushes. Moving on to the side deck, we have 2 Battle Oxes, just if we want to bring in more beaters to get more offensive pressure going. We have our standard Exodia Hate package. We have 3 Card Destruction, 3 Dispel, and 3 Remove Trap to deal with any stalling tactics that we may encounter. And we have 3 Reinforcements. If we're going up against a more aggressive deck and we want to bring in our Battle Oxes, or if we're going up against a more defensive deck that's setting a lot of defenders, Reinforcement can be a very good option. And lastly, we have a Fisher. This is, again, for more of those defensive decks because this can clear monsters like defenders. But that's going to do it for this deck breakdown of what I term Worm Reaction. I think it's a really cool way to play the Wicked Worm Beast deck, and it's a really interesting contrast to the more aggressive Worm Beast deck. I also think that you can definitely mix and match the two sort of extremes of the deck. Like, you could potentially side out the Wall of Illusions for some Battle Oxes and Neos to get a bit more offensive pressure here, while also keeping the Man-Eater Bugs and the Ultimate Offering package to have that sort of defensive removal during your opponent's turn. I think that there are many different ways to sort of play this, and that's part of why I love the Wicked Worm Beast so much, because it really, really enables you to personalize the exact sort of strategy you want to use it in. But there are also some aggro decks in the format that are perfectly decent that don't use the Wicked Worm Beast. So let's dive into one of those. The first of these other aggro decks that I want to talk about is what I like to call Conga Line aggro. Now, this is kind of a funny name, but I've named the deck this because instead of trying to maintain a card advantage with the Wicked Worm Beast, what this deck's trying to do is basically keep summoning out big beaters every turn, just like a conga line of monsters. So let's dive into the deck breakdown real quick. We of course have 3 Lajin, 3 Neo, 3 Battle Ox, the standard big beater package. But in addition to those monsters, we also have the next highest attack beaters in the form of Great Whites and Rogue Dolls. Now, as I mentioned before, there are actually some other cards that also have 1600 attack in the form of Ryukishin Powered and Man-Eating Treasure Chest. So we could also add in those if we want more monsters. But I think that this is probably enough to be pretty good. Now, the reason this deck isn't playing Wicked Worm Beast is because it's trying to maintain board presence as much as possible, and preferably would always have at least one monster on board. Now, with all the various removal spells in the format, this is unlikely to happen, but given things like Ultimate Offering, which can bring out more monsters during your opponent's turn, and things like Waboku and Trap Hole, which can stop your opponent's plans in their tracks, this generally isn't the worst thing in the world. And your opponent will have to use removal on all of these monsters. There is a lot of removal in the format, but your opponent does have to draw that removal in order to use it. So this deck is hoping that it can sort of out-monster your opponent's removal. To this end, this deck doesn't really care about the resource advantage that Wicked Worm Beast provides, because it's basically hoping to use up your opponent's resources rather than prevent them from using them at all. Moving on to the spells, we have 3 Raigeki, the standard removal spell in the format, and only 2 Dark Hole. Now, you might be wondering why not 3, and the reason for this is because we're trying to keep our beaters on the board, so in general, we might not have an empty board for Dark Hole to be effective on. Now, you could even go so far as to cut Dark Hole entirely from your deck if this is something that you want to do, and play something instead like a Stop Defense, which is meant to clear your opponent's defensive monsters, which is reasonably the major hurdle that this deck will face. You could also even include a Fisher here if you're worried about your opponent's beaters over the defense position monsters. Now, the friend who I got this deck idea from actually does prefer the Stop Defenses, but I still prefer the Dark Holes, just because I think, given the large amount of removal in this format, you are likely to have an empty board at multiple times during the game, so Dark Hole can still be effective. And also, given things like Waboku in the format that can stop your attacks from getting through even if you do switch a monster to attack, I think that Dark Hole is still good, even in this deck that wants to keep up board presence at all times. We also have Change of Hearts and Monster Reborns just to keep up the aggressive pressure. Change of Heart lets us take our opponent's monster and attack with it. Monster Reborn lets us bring back one of our own monsters or one of our opponent's beaters to attack in with it. So these cards both keep up the offensive pressure very nicely. And of course we have 3 Pot of Greed just to draw into more cards. Now you may notice we're not on Swords Revealing Light, and this is because we are just trying to be as aggressive as possible. So while Swords is an incredibly good card, there aren't really any pieces of the deck that we really need to draw into to make this deck work. And we will hopefully not need to stall our opponent for 3 turns because we'll hopefully have the offensive edge at all times. Moving on to the traps, we have 3 copies of Reinforcements, which is incredibly good in this deck given the large amount of beaters in it. Reinforcements can let any of these beaters get over a 2k defender, and in addition, Reinforcements can basically turn any of these attackers into the highest attack beat stick that you'll need. You might be worried about something like Rogue Doll or Great White's low attack when you first see this deck, but with a Reinforcements, these monsters can both get over something like a Lodge-In, Battleox, Neo, any of the other more premier beaters in the format. And if your opponent wants to counteract that, they'll have to waste a Reinforcements of their own. So, Reinforcements is an incredibly good card in this deck, and part of what really helps this deck function. We of course also have 3 Trap Holes. Trap Holes are great at being removable on our opponent's turn and can also clear problematic cards like the Wicked Worm Beast. We have 3 Waboku, which are just incredibly good, even if we are trying to keep on the offensive pressure and we don't really care about stalling our opponent, as I mentioned with Swords. Waboku is incredibly good at potentially preserving our own monsters on the field. If our opponent would attack into one of our weaker beaters with something like a Lodge-In, we can use Waboku to protect them as a last resort. We can crash defenders, like we can attack our opponent's Lodge-In with one of our Lodge-Ins and use Waboku to keep it alive. There's many applications of this card beyond just the defensive purpose that is the most obvious. So it's definitely worth keeping in this deck. And then we have 2 Ultimate Offerings. Ultimate Offerings are great at letting us make offensive pushes, since we'll likely have multiple beaters in hand. So if our opponent has an empty back row, we can feel comfortable just making a huge offensive push and potentially winning the game off of this card. But more importantly, Ultimate Offering does serve a defensive purpose, letting us bring out a beat stick and attack to block our opponent's attack. Now, this is susceptible to something like a Trap Hole, of course, but it's still a very good defensive option in a pinch because it does dodge removal. So, Ultimate Offering is a pretty good card in this deck, and that's why we're playing 2 copies instead of just 1, because the deck doesn't really have any other defensive options besides Waboku and Trap Hole, and this can really help us just not die. And it can help us, of course, make huge offensive pushes that help us close out the game. So, very good card. Moving on to the side deck, we have 3 Card Destruction, 3 Dispel, 3 Remove Trap, the classic anti-Exodia, anti-stall package. Card Destruction to discard your opponent's Exodia pieces, Dispel to get rid of your opponent's Swords Revealing Light, and Remove Trap to get rid of your opponent's Ultimate Offerings. You might wonder why there's no Dispel in the main deck, because this deck is so aggressively focused. You might think, well, Dispel can get rid of our opponent's swords, let us keep the offensive pressure up. The thing is that Dispel can be a dead card if we draw it when our opponent doesn't have swords, and our deck has enough monsters that we don't necessarily care about waiting 3 turns on their swords. We'll still be able to go on the offensive afterwards, even if our opponent does draw advantageous cards to use. So that's why Dispel's in the side deck, although I wouldn't blame you for including a copy in the main deck. We also have 2 Stop Defense in the side here as well. As I said, Dark Hole is kind of a contentious choice in this deck, and some people prefer Stop Defense to it. So I do think Stop Defense is a decent card to use in this deck, especially against a deck that is going more all in on defenders, like a stall strategy. So I do think Stop Defense is a good option to bring in against those sorts of strategies. But we also have the third Dark Hole in here for decks that are sort of doing a similar thing to us, but are able to potentially clear our monsters better. So the Dark Hole's here for similar matchups, but potentially matchups against the next deck that we'll talk about. And lastly, we have 3 the Wicked Worm Beasts. Now, I mentioned earlier that this deck strategy doesn't really revolve around the Wicked Worm Beast, which is still very true, but there are some matchups where the Wicked Worm Beast is actually incredibly good over something like a 1600 beater. For instance, the next deck that I'm going to talk about really suffers against Wicked Worm Beast, and so I think that bringing in Wicked Worm Beast could be incredibly good in that scenario. But this is the conga line aggro deck, as I call it. I think this deck is actually pretty good, and probably the best of the aggro strategies that don't use the Wicked Worm Beast. And I even think that this card can contend with Wicked Worm Beast decks at times. More the Wicked Worm aggro side of things than the Wicked Worm reaction side of things. But I do think that this deck can put up a major fight and win games pretty well. So I think this deck is very good. But there's one more aggro deck that I want to talk about that does not use the Wicked Worm Beast that still has a very interesting strategy. So the last aggro deck that I want to talk about is something I call Tribute Aggro. So this deck doesn't actually rely on the Wicked Worm Beast to win. What it's hoping to do is to leverage the power of Summon Skull and Change of Heart in conjunction to clear its opponent's board and also to bring out a big beater at the same time. So let's dive into the deck breakdown. We of course are playing a full suite of all the level 4 beat sticks. So we have 3 Lodge In, 3 Neo, 3 Battle Ox. This is just to keep up constant offensive pressure on our opponent. But you'll notice that we are also playing 3 2K Defenders. And the reason we are playing these 2K Defenders are both to stop our opponent's offensive pushes and also to hopefully have a monster stick around on the field to tribute out a Summon Skull when we don't actually have Change of Hearts. What the deck is intending to do is to bring out a Summon Skull using an opponent's monster that has been taken with Change of Heart. But if you don't have Change of Heart and you just have a Summon Skull sitting in your hand, it is good to have a backup option like Giant Soldier of Stone. Moving on to the spells, we of course have our standard removal suite of 3 Raigeki, 3 Dark Holes, and 3 Change of Hearts, which actually can function as removal in this deck. Because with your Summon Skulls, you can take control of an opponent's monster and tribute it off to bring out a Summon Skull. So it's very good. We're playing 3 of it because we definitely want to see it in conjunction with the Summon Skull at some point in the game. You might be wondering why we're not playing 3 Summon Skull. The reason for that is if we draw multiple Change of Heart without seeing many Summon Skull, that's okay. Change of Heart's still a very powerful card. If we draw multiple Summon Skull without seeing Change of Heart, that's a bit worse for us because Summon Skull can just sit in the hand as a dead card if we don't have any monsters on the field, or it can just deprive us of too many resources if we have to tribute off a monster and bring it out, and our opponent has some form of removal. So that's why we're playing only 2, and why we're playing 3 Change of Heart. We also have Monster Reborn. These can be good at bringing back our Summon Skull and making a huge offensive push, or it can be good at just getting out tribute fodder for the Summon Skull. So it's a pretty good card in this deck. We have 3 Pot of Greed just to draw deeper into our deck, potentially draw the combo. And we have 3 Sword of Revealing Light to stall to get us more time to draw into our pieces, and just to be an all-around good card. Moving on to the traps, we have 3 Wabokus, of course. Easily one of the best cards in this format, as I've said before. Stops your opponent's offensive pushes. And with the other traps, we have kind of an interesting sort of ratios. So we have one Ultimate Offering. Ultimate Offering can be especially good when combined with Giant Soldier of Stone in hand to stop our opponent's offensive plays. It can also be good at getting out a Summon Skull because we can use Ultimate Offering, normal summon or set a monster, and then use Ultimate Offering again to tribute out the Summon Skull. So Ultimate Offering can unbrick our hand a bit if we do have a Summon Skull and we don't have a Change of Heart. So we are playing one copy of it. We're not playing more because we really don't want to see more than one of this because then it's kind of useless. And then for the other traps, we have 2 trap holes. Now, we don't have 3 trap holes because we do want our opponent's monsters to stick on the board so we can take them with a Change of Heart and summon out a Summon Skull. And we don't have 1 or 0 of this because Trap Hole is one of the only cards in our deck that effectively deals with the Wicked Worm Beast. And since the Wicked Worm Beast is such a prevalent card in this format, we definitely want to have Trap Holes in here to counteract that strategy if it comes up. So that's why we have Trap Holes. We're playing 2 copies of Reinforcements because we have a lot of good level 4 beaters, and we don't have the space for 3. We could put in an extra copy of Reinforcements going up to 41 cards, but this deck is already kind of inconsistent enough in cases where you draw a Summon Skull and you don't draw a Change of Heart or vice versa. So we don't want to increase the possibility of just not being able to draw into our combo. So that's why we're sticking at 40 cards, and that's why we're sticking at only 2 Reinforcements. In the side deck, we have, of course, our anti-stall hate. We have 3 card destruction, 3 dispel, 3 remove trap. We have an additional trap hole if our opponent's playing Wicked Worm Beasts. We have an additional reinforcements in case our opponent's playing a more defensive strategy, and we can get over their monsters with our beaters. And we are also playing 3 Wicked Worm Beasts because sometimes if you can't beat them, you got to join them. Wicked Worm Beast really messes up this strategy of taking our opponent's monsters and bringing out a Summon Skull. So we do want to have the ability to pivot and side into Wicked Worm Beast aggro. And for that end, we also have multiple Ultimate Offering if we want to really put on the offensive pressure with our deck and just bring out a ton of offensive threats in one turn and attack in and ruin our opponent's day. You could potentially argue that one of these should be replaced with a remove trap because remove trap is just really good at getting rid of ultimate offerings, and that is a reasonable suggestion. So you can do that if you want. This build has 2 ultimate offering and 2 remove trap, however, mainly because this deck actually has a decent matchup against stall decks because you can take whatever monsters they set and summon out a Summon Skull. So we don't really care too much about clearing their ultimate offerings. Of course, it would be nice, which is why we have 2, but you know, we value the ability to go into a more offensive version of the deck over being able to clear ultimate offerings. Now, as I said, I think this deck is decent. I think it can win games. However, I do think that it is not as good as Wicked Worm Beast decks because Wicked Worm Beast decks, you know, they're not inconsistent in the slightest most of the time. Maybe the Worm Beast reaction version if you don't draw ultimate offerings, but even then that deck is still pretty good. And it doesn't have cards that are just unusable because Summon Skull in your hand without your other pieces, it's just not very good. So I do think the Wicked Worm Beast deck is better in general. Also, it gets around this deck pretty well because they won't have a monster on board for you to Change of Heart into your Summon Skull. So I do think Wicked Worm Beast is a bit better. But this deck is still pretty fun to play, and it can still take names. So that's why I am talking about it here. Anyways, now that we've discussed all the aggro decks that I think can reasonably do a good job of winning, let's discuss the other sorts of aggro strategies you can play and why I think they don't quite cut the mustard. Okay, now let's talk about the other directions you can go with aggro strategies and why I think they aren't quite good enough to actually merit a deck breakdown. So firstly, you could go even harder on the Tribute Aggro strategy, bringing in, 3 copies of Summon Skull and additional copies of the next highest Tribute monster, Judgeman. Now, Judgeman, like Summon Skull, is a 1 Tribute monster that can get over the 2k defenders, so it can accomplish the goal that you want with Summon Skull, and it can also be used to tribute off monsters that you take with Change of Heart. However, as I said in the Tribute Aggro section, I already think the deck is inconsistent enough just playing 2 Summon Skull. So I think increasing the amount of Tribute monsters makes the deck actively worse, especially given how easy it is to get rid of Tribute Summon monsters with all the different forms of removal in this set. Now, the Tribute Aggro strategy does kind of have another tool to its name in the form of Soul Exchange, which does let you Tribute Summon using your opponent's monsters. However, it also takes away your battle phase the turn you use it, and given the vast amount of removal in this set, that Tribute monster you bring out likely isn't surviving your opponent's turn. So it's essentially just a removal spell that requires you to use 2 cards to do it, and also prevents you from capitalizing on that removal by attacking in. So I don't think it's a very good aggressive tool in this format, given the large amounts of removal. Now, you could wonder about bumping up the Tribute monsters to 2 Tribute monsters, like Blue Eyes White Dragon. Blue Eyes White Dragon still is the premier version of one of these monsters, with 3000 attack, which outclasses all other 2 Tribute monsters. But again, I don't think 2 Tribute monsters are very good. They require too much resources to use up, even if you can use up one of your opponent's resources in the process with something like a Change of Heart or Soul Exchange. And they're just not quite worth it, especially when a 1 Tribute monster can essentially accomplish the same thing that a 2 Tribute monster can with the new inclusions of Summon Skull and Judgeman. So I don't think that Tribute summoning out a Blue Eyes is necessarily the best strategy. However, there is another strategy you can use in this format that does play Blue Eyes and can get it out through other means. And that strategy is the Dragon strategy. The Dragon strategy revolves around using Lord of D and the spell Fluid Summoning Dragon to summon out multiple dragons that are protected from your opponent's effects. Now, Lord of D is a bit of a problematic and controversial card in this sort of format because it kind of had 2 printings at the time. There was a mistranslation in its effect that basically caused its effect to prevent dragon monsters from being affected by card effects, period, instead of just being protected from card effects that target. So what this means is that in the mistranslated version of Lord of D, your opponent could activate a Dark Hole and only Lord of D would be destroyed, while the dragon monsters you have on the field would not be. Whereas in the Lord of D, that's the correct version that prevents targeting only, all your monsters would be destroyed by that Dark Hole, since Dark Hole doesn't actually target. So clearly the version of Lord of D that's mistranslated is the better version. And there's the question of, does that make the dragon deck good with that version of Lord of D? And thus, does that make this deck, really dependent on which translation is being used? The answer to that question is no. Lord of D's effect is very good in the mistranslated version, but the issue with the dragon deck is not necessarily that it dies to removal, which it does. The main issue with making this combo work is that you need to have Lord of D, a Flute of Summoning Dragon, and some amount of dragon monsters in your hand to summon out with the Flute of Summoning Dragon. So it's a major, major amount of resources to sink in to getting a Lord of D and some amount of dragons on the board. And it's just way too inconsistent. There are ways to make it more consistent, which I'll mention shortly. But I think with either version of the effect, this strategy is not very good. I will say that I personally think that the version of Lord D that should be played is the correct version and that the mistranslation should be disregarded. But honestly, you can play it either way you want because this format isn't really official anyways. And I'm mainly making this video so that you could play this format with your friends. And of course, if you're playing with friends, you can sort of decide on your own which version you want to play with. Now, I mentioned a way to make this deck a bit more consistent, and that way is using the spell card Last Will. Now, Last Will is a very, very confusing spell card, but basically the way it works is the turn you activate it, if a monster is sent from your field to the graveyard that turn, you can special summon out a monster with 1,500 less attack points from your deck. So here's basically how it works. There are two sorts of scenarios that we have to consider with Last Will. The first is when a monster has already been sent from your field to the graveyard during this turn. In this case, if you activate Last Will, it will immediately special summon out a monster with 1,500 or less attack from your deck. The second case is if a monster has not been sent from your field to the graveyard during this turn. In that case, the first time a monster is sent from your field to the graveyard that turn, you can trigger Last Will's effect in the graveyard to special summon out a monster with 1,500 or less attack from your deck. Note that this also applies if you've activated multiple Last Wills during the turn, so each one of them will trigger in a chain. Last Will can be useful for getting out a Lord of D from your deck, especially if you're playing tribute monsters, because you could potentially be playing Curse of Dragon, tribute summon out Curse of Dragon, you've sent a monster from your field to the graveyard to tribute out Curse of Dragon, activate Last Will, and bring out the Lord of D. So this does make the deck slightly more consistent, potentially. However, the issue is that you have to have some way to get rid of your monsters on your turn. And frankly, the deck doesn't play enough consistent ways to do that. So mainly the way that this would increase consistency is that you'd rely on your opponent to have a trap hole for a monster that you bring out. And then you activate Last Will to bring out Lord of D. But this is all sort of like a convoluted example. And I don't think it actually improves the deck that much. But Last Will could potentially have other applications in other decks. For instance, in a Wicked Wormbeast deck, you might be thinking, well, Last Will is pretty good because if they manage to clear either like a Lodge-In or a Battle Ox that I bring out, or if they manage to trap hole one of my Wicked Wormbeasts, I can activate Last Will and bring out another one. I don't think this is a wrong line of reasoning. I think Last Will can be useful in a Wicked Wormbeast deck. The only issue with it is that I think pretty much every card in a Wicked Wormbeast deck is incredibly powerful, and I don't think that Last Will is worth including over any of those. I also don't think it's worth including the deck and going above 40 cards, because then it just makes your deck a bit more inconsistent, and the original purpose of including Last Will was to make the deck more consistent in the first place. So I don't actually think it's good in that build, and I think in general it's not very good in this format, even though it can be useful to bring out certain monsters that you want to see. Moving on to the next potential monster that you could include, we have Mysterious Puppeteer. Now, I think this card is a bit more useful for stall decks, but it does have some niche applications in decks playing Ultimate Offering. So, before I dive into that, I just want to explain that just like Lord of D, Mysterious Puppeteer actually had a mistranslation in its effect, and its mistranslated effect basically read that each time you or your opponent normal summons, or flips face up a monster, increase your life points by 500, whereas the correct version of the effect doesn't increase your life points by 500 when a monster is flipped up. I really don't think this matters much. It matters even less than the Lord of D sort of effect debate, because this card is not the centerpiece of a strategy. It is very much kind of like a win more card in that the main application for this card that I can see is in decks playing Ultimate Offering. If they want to make a big offensive push, bring out a bunch of monsters, they can play the Mysterious Puppeteer first and then gain back the life points that they would lose through Ultimate Offering. I don't think that this card is worth including in those sorts of decks because in general, the cost of Ultimate Offering that you're paying is not very high compared to what you're getting out of it. And so most of the time you'd prefer to just have another card in hand to capitalize on Ultimate Offering more than having the Mysterious Puppeteer to make back the, let's say, 1,000 life points potentially that you've lost with the card. So I don't think it's very good, but if you're worried about the life point cost of Ultimate Offering, you can play it. Moving on to the classic inferior aggro feature from last format's guide, we have tribal strategies. Now, tribal strategies, again, are strategies that rely on using monsters of the same type or attribute to give them sort of buffs, either through equip spells or field spells. We have some new inclusions into the equip spell realm of tribal buffs. And the first of these is Sword of Dark Destruction. Sword of Dark Destruction equips to a dark monster and it gains 400 attack and loses 200 defense. The 200 defense debuff doesn't really matter because you're generally never going to use this on a defender. You're just going to use this on an attacker. Now, last time I mentioned that a lot of these equip spells were not very good because they couldn't let your beat sticks get over 2k defenders. Well, Sword of Dark Destruction actually can let your La Jin get over a 2k defender by boosting its attack up to 2400. It can also boost the attack of things like Man-Eating Treasure Chests and Ryukishin Powered up to 2000 as well, making them very formidable beat sticks and allowing them to get over something like a Wall of Illusion. So you could reasonably play Sword of Dark Destruction in a deck featuring all these relatively sizable beat sticks and even include something like a Dark Energy, which will also put La Jin up over a 2k defender. The reason why I don't think this is very good is because Reinforcements is a card that exists in this format, and Reinforcements boosts up attack by more. So even if you have a La Jin boosted with a Sword of Dark Destruction and you attack into your opponent's La Jin, they can just activate Reinforcements and get over your buffed monster. In addition, given the heavy amount of removal in this set, I don't think that a La Jin or another monster equipped with something like a Sword of Dark Destruction or a Dark Energy will last more than one turn. And thus, it basically functions as sort of a removal spell to remove a defender from the field, but not a very good removal spell, because there are just so many other options that are infinitely better, including Reinforcements. So, I don't think that this strategy is very good, but it has gotten slightly better from last format. Moving on to other tribal strategies, as I mentioned before, you can use either Sogen or Forest to buff up a Battle Ox to beat over a La Jin. However, I don't think that this is very good, as most decks will probably be playing a Battle Ox because they're probably going to be playing some form of 1700 beater. And if this strategy actually was good, every deck would just play Battle Ox as their 1700 beater of choice. So this isn't really a one-sided buff like Sogen Aggro was in the last format, so I don't think it's very good. As a note, though, Earth monsters also received an equip spell kind of like Sword of Dark Destruction in the form of Invigoration, which boosts their attack by 400 and decreases their defense by 200. Now, just like Sword of Dark Destruction, this enables a Battle Ox to get over a 2k defender, but just like Sword of Dark Destruction, I don't think it's very good because, again, you could just use a different removal spell or trap card instead. As another note, though, Invigoration does let Judgeman get over Summon Skull. I don't think this matters. I don't think that will ever come up, but it is kind of funny to see. So again, I don't think these equip spells really cut the mustard given the heavy amount of removal in the format, but that may change in the future. The last tribal strategy I want to mention is sort of an Umi aggro. So it's basically trying to do the same thing that Sogen aggro did in using Umi to buff up Great Whites in order to make it so that you're essentially playing extra copies of La Jin. The only issue with this is that deck space is very tight in this format, and most aggro decks aren't even playing the 1600 beaters, unlike last format where most decks were playing at least one or two 1400 beaters. In addition, Umi and Great White doesn't actually get over a La Jin, unlike Sogen and Celtic Guardian, which was able to get over a Skull Redbird. So I think this deck is not very good, and not even as good as Sogen aggro was in the last format. So I just think it's a pretty bad deck. But it is a direction you can go with a tribal strategy similar to Sogen aggro. The last sort of aggressive strategy we have here is Burn. And Burn received 2 new cards. One is Okazi, which inflicts 800 damage to your opponent. And the other is Just Desert, which inflicts 500 damage to your opponent for each monster they control. Now, ignoring Just Deserts for now because it's got a conditional amount of damage that it can deal, adding Okazi to all the other burn cards. So if you played 3 of every burn card in the format except for Just Desserts, then adding 3 Okazis would get you up to a grand total of 6,300, which is a sizable amount of damage. Combining this with 3 activations of Just Desserts, that will probably get you in between 500 and 1,000 damage every time you use them, and that does put you over the 8,000 life point threshold. So you could reasonably burn your opponent to death using all the burn cards available in the game. However, this isn't really the best strategy because, as I mentioned last time, you're likely going to get more damage in by, instead of using these burn cards, just using a removal spell and a monster. So these cards aren't really the best, even though they can technically win a game. And I think that there's pretty bad. I mean, Just Desserts is slightly better in my opinion, because if you play it right, you can generally punish your opponent for making big offensive pushes, especially if they're using Ultimate Offering to burn themselves down a bit. But I think it's just too circumstantial. I think it won't come up in enough matches. And if your opponent's making those big offensive pushes, you're probably going to lose, despite the fact that you did a bit of chip damage against them with Just Desserts. So I don't actually think they're that good, even though this is basically the only strategy that can get around Waboku. Anyways, that covers pretty much all the inferior aggro strategies that I can think of in this format. If you can think of any more, please let me know in the comments down below. Or if you think that any of these strategies are actually better than I'm making them out to be in this format. But now that I've covered all the sorts of aggro strategies that you can do in this format, let's dive into the stall strategies, because this format, unlike the last one, actually has a couple of viable stall strategies that are pretty interesting. Stall decks received some majorly important cards this format, so let's just dive into all the different stall cards that you can potentially use before diving into the decks themselves. So, firstly, Swords of Revealing Light, great card for stall decks. Even though Dispel exists to clear it away, it can still stop your opponent in their tracks if they don't have a Dispel on hand. So still very good. Should be included in 3 copies in pretty much every stall deck. We also have Waboku, which, as I've mentioned throughout, is just an incredibly powerful card, both for aggressive decks and for stall decks, but especially for stall decks, as this can prevent you from taking any damage from your opponent's big offensive pushes, and buy you just one more turn to try and achieve your win condition. Next, we have Ultimate Offering, which does have aggressive capabilities, just like Waboku does, but its defensive capabilities are incredibly strong, and it can just be used to dodge your opponent's removal with your defenders by paying 500 during their battle phase to bring out a defender. Because most of the time, what you're blocking is more than 500 damage. So it's worth paying the cost. Just sort of view it as a lessened version of that attack. So it's very, very good and can be very, very hard for a lot of decks to deal with. Moving on to the stalled cards that are not quite as good, and honestly that I would not even include in decks. We first have Castle Walls. Now, Castle Walls can increase the defense of your monster by 500 points, which can protect one of your defenders from an opponent's monster that's buffed up with reinforcements. However, that's a very niche sort of situation to pop up, and they're just better cards instead of this. Like, if your opponent clears your monster with a reinforcements, you'd rather have just another defender to be able to set with Ultimate Offering than you would Castle Walls to protect that original defender. Because another defender is also better in most other circumstances, whereas Castle Wall requires a very specific circumstance to be useful. Moving on to life point gain, we have Diane Keto the Cure Master. This is a spell card that increases your life points by 1,000 points, which is strictly better than Goblin's Secret Remedy and Red Medicine, which were introduced in LOB. So with that substantial increase in life points, is this card actually worth playing? Well, I'm of a mixed mind here, kind of, because I do think that it has some reasonable application in the Stall Mill deck that I will talk about later that leverages card destruction to mill out your opponent. Because something that deck can suffer from is having large hands when they want to activate card destruction, but being unable to actually get cards out of their hand so that they won't deck themselves out. So Diane Keto is a spell that you can activate at any time to increase your life points. So it both makes it harder for your opponent to kill you, and it becomes a card that you don't have to worry about for card destruction. So I do think that it has niche applications there. However, in general, I just don't think it does enough. And I think that there are other ways to get around these sort of risks of playing card destruction that you just have to sort of like play better during the game. I think that Diane Keto just doesn't do enough in most games, and I think that even though it has the advantage of being activated at any time in the card destruction deck, I think that if you're playing that deck well and keeping track of what's going on and what you can actually get rid of from your hand very easily, then I think that that may wind up not being a problem at all at the end of the game. So I think that it doesn't do enough, but I also wouldn't begrudge you if you include it in one of those card destruction decks just to make it a little bit easier to win. Now to revisit a card that I mentioned in the aggro section, Mysterious Puppeteer is slightly better in stall decks because, of course, it gains you life points, which increases the amount of damage that your opponent has to deal to you to win. However, I think that you're very unlikely to reap many benefits from this effect, as you have to have it face up on your field to work. So you could normal summon this card in attack mode, but then your opponent could just walk into it with one of their monsters and kill it and deal damage to you. And damage that's likely to be more than the 500 that you'll gain from its effect. So I don't really think it's that good in stall decks, just like I don't think it's very good in aggro decks. But if you really want it, and you want to keep it alive with stuff like Waboku and potentially Castle Walls, then you can use it. I just think it's a pretty bad card. Lastly, we have sort of an interesting application of Soul Exchange. So I mentioned Soul Exchange being bad in the aggro section of this video, and I still think it is bad, but I think it can actually be slightly better in stall decks. So stall decks don't care about losing their battle phase, and they also want a lot of removal. They also like having big defenders on their side of the field. So with the new defender, Gyakutenu Megami, which is a level 6 monster with 2000 defense, the highest defense on a 1 tribute monster, And with the good old Reaper of the Cards from LOB format that just wasn't good enough to see play, I think that Soul Exchange can actually be a decent option, especially since there are more trap cards to hit in this format with Reaper of the Cards. And Reaper of the Cards' 1930 defense is still pretty good at stopping pretty much any attacker that you'd want to. Now, the reason I don't necessarily think this is the best strategy is because I think it's a bit too inconsistent, and stall decks really want to be drawing cards that really help them survive each turn as much as possible. So I don't think it's worth including this sort of package, even though if you do actually manage to pull it off, it can be very powerful. Also, with Change of Heart being very prevalent in this format, and Gyakutenu Megami having a sizable 1800 attack, and Reaper of the Cards having a flip effect that could be used to devastating effect against a stall deck that's relying on Ultimate Offering, I think that it's just a bit too risky to play in this format. But it is an interesting option for stall decks. Now let's get into the actual different types of decks that you can play in the stall variety. So of course we have the classic Exodia, the forbidden one. Exodia does have a lot of targeted hate against it now in the form of things like card destruction, but I still think the deck is pretty decent, especially at winning game 1 of a match. And oftentimes, even if your opponent activates a card destruction, clearing away some of your pieces, that won't clear away all 3 of any given piece. It will just make your win condition harder to find, which is annoying, but not backbreaking for the deck. So I do think that is still a very, very good option in the stall direction. And it's probably the best stall deck, although there is one other deck that sort of vies for that title. That deck is the stall mill deck. Now, I mentioned this deck last format as a deck that is basically unplayable because you'd have to wait for your opponent to draw through all 40 cards of their deck, which just takes too much time, and you would just lose the game before that happened. Card destruction, along with the powerful new stall tools like Waboku and Ultimate Offering, makes this a bit more reasonable of a goal. You can realistically drag out the game to a point where your opponent has very few cards in the deck, like maybe 9 or 10, and if they have 3 cards in their hand when they have 9 cards in their deck, and you activate 3 consecutive card destructions, which you'll likely draw over the course of the game, or potentially draw into with your own card destructions, then you can cause them to deck out on their next turn. Or you could just cause them to deck out through card destruction's effect itself if they have more cards in hand than remain in their deck. It is a slog of a strategy. It just slows games to a halt and can be very unfun to play and play against. But I do think it's a viable stall strategy for those people who just hate actually playing the game and want to ruin everyone's time, which is, most stall players. Lastly, we have a stall burn strategy. Now, I mentioned in the aggro section that burn cards are now able to potentially deal all 8,000 damage to an opponent and wipe out their life through burn alone. However, I don't think the deck is very good because you have to play so many cards that burn your opponent and deprive you of powerful stall tools. So I don't think that the deck is very good even in a stall deck, just like it's not good in an aggro deck. So I don't think stall burn's the way to go. I think the 2 most valuable stall decks are Exodia and stall mill. So let's dive in to potential builds for each of those decks. Now, as I said, I think probably the best stall deck in the format is the Exodia stall deck. Now, just like I said last format, the goal of this deck is to draw into 1 copy of each of the 5 pieces of Exodia over the course of the game, and basically stall your opponent until you can achieve that goal. So let's dive into the deck breakdown to see where this deck differs from its version in last format. Firstly, just like last format, we have 3 of each piece. Again, this is great at just increasing the consistency of being able to draw into your 5 pieces of Exodia. So I do think it is necessary to play each copy at 3, especially given card destruction being in the format, because having each copy at 3 decreases the chances of losing all 3 of any one copy due to a bad card destruction. It can still happen, but this decreases the chances. So each copy's at 3, and then for our defenders of choice, we have Spirit of the Harp and Mystical Elf. Now you might be wondering why we don't have Man-Eater Bug or Giant Soldier of Stone like we had last time. The reason for this is because of Change of Heart. Now, if our opponent takes one of our defenders that we bring out with a Change of Heart, then having lower attack point on them will actually make it so that we take less damage if they switch them to attack and attack in with it. So it's only 500 damage difference, but I do think it can matter, and every life point that you're able to save is worth considering. I also think that Man-Eater Bug really has a bad matchup against Change of Heart, and also just doesn't stick around on the field. Decks are playing less Fissures now, so honestly, having a defender on the field might stick for a longer amount of time than it did last format when Fissures and stop defenses were so prevalent. So I think going just pure defenders, I think that's actually pretty good. You can add in Man-Eater Bugs if you want, or you can add in like Giant Soldiers of Stone or things like that if you're not really worried about the attack mattering off of a Change of Heart. But I think it can matter, which is why I'm playing these 5 defenders instead of other options. For our spells, we of course have our classic removal suite of Raigekis and Dark Holes. We also have Pot of Greeds to draw deeper into our deck, try to draw more of those Exodia pieces. And we also have Swords of Revealing Light, the premier stall tool. For the traps, we have 3 trap holes, great at removing our opponent's threats on their turn, especially when it comes to the Wicked Worm Beast, which can otherwise dodge our removal. We have 3 Waboku, another premier stall tool, one of the best cards in the set in my opinion. And then we have 2 Ultimate Offerings. Now, you could argue that we should go up to 3 Ultimate Offerings and maybe cut one of the defenders, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. The only issue is that if we cut a defender, it makes our Ultimate Offerings less likely to be actually online. And if we draw multiple Ultimate Offerings, then it's kind of bad because it clogs up our hand, and we don't really need more copies of it if we already have 1 on the field, especially because our opponent is likely to not have a remove trap in their main deck game 1. So that's the main deck, and it basically plays the same way as it did last format, except now with Ultimate Offerings, enabling you to bring out defenders during your opponent's turn. So let's dive into the side deck. So in the side deck, it is again a smokescreen side, with card destruction and dispel being in the format. Exodia really suffers in games 2 and 3 if your opponent brings those into the deck. So we've got the smokescreen aggro side. We have 3 Wicked Worm Beasts because it's incredibly good and our opponent might have buffed up the amount of removal that they have. We have 3 Battle Ox, 3 La Jin, just being premier 4-star beaters. We have reinforcements to enable our beaters to potentially get over their beaters that have reinforcements, because likely our opponent is going to side in reinforcements to get over our defenders. And then we have 3 Change of Hearts. Now, you could argue that these 3 Change of Hearts should be 3 Monster Reborns, because we want to be able to recover our Wicked Worm Beast in case it goes to the graveyard. The reason why I'm playing Change of Hearts over Monster Reborns is that it's very likely that our opponent will side out the trap holes if they are anticipating that we're not going to be summoning monsters. And trap hole is the main way to deal with the Wicked Worm Beast. So I don't anticipate many Wicked Worm Beasts being destroyed to trap hole. Our opponent will likely also side in card destruction, which can really mess up our Wicked Worm Beasts. And so if you're worried about the card destructions, then you can definitely play Monster Reborns instead, just to have a way to recover the Wicked Worm Beasts. But I think Change of Heart also puts on a lot of offensive pressure on our opponent. And for the aggro deck that we want to smoke screen into, we really want offensive pressure because we're already playing sort of weak cards in an aggro deck in Mystical Elf and Spirit of the Harps. And those cards can really clog up our hand when we want to go aggressive. So I think having a Change of Heart is a bit more of an aggressive option than having a Monster Reborn. So that's why I'm playing the 3 Change of Heart instead of the Monster Reborns. But that's my version of the deck. I think that there are definitely ways to get flexible with it in terms of what defenders you actually want to use and what exactly you use in the Smokescreen aggro side deck, and also the exact number of ultimate offerings that you have. But I still think this deck is very good at what it does, and it does pretty much the same thing it did last format. It plays game 1 hoping to pull off Exodia, which it likely can, and then it goes into aggro for games 2 and 3. Although it is slightly weaker than last format because the aggro deck it sides into is not really optimal, unlike last format. But unlike last format, Exodia isn't the only stall deck you can make. So let's see what's going on with that other deck. So the other direction you can go with stall is stall mill. Now, the goal of this deck, as I mentioned in the stall tools section of the video, is basically to stall your opponent out to a point where their deck is low enough that you can then deck them out by playing 3 copies of Card Destruction. This is a much more, I'd say, degenerate strategy than the Exodia stall deck, which I never thought I'd say, but it's just something. It's something to behold. I will show off a video with myself playing this, and it's, it is a pretty disgusting deck when it manages to do what it wants to do. But let's dive in to the deck breakdown. So firstly, we've got the monsters. We have a ton of defenders, and like I mentioned in the Exodia section, these defenders have the lowest attack on a 2k defender, mainly because we're worried about Change of Heart, and we don't want that Change of Heart to be used to get in too much extra damage. Not that, there's much difference between Aqua Matador's 1200 and Giant Soldier Stone's 1300, but this is just a personal preference of mine. We also have 3 Wall of Illusion, 3 Maneater Bug. These are mainly to play off of our ultimate offerings, but can be good even in situations where we don't have ultimate offering, at potentially just clearing away one of our opponent's monsters with Maneater Bug. Wall of Illusion has an added, very funny benefit of bouncing a monster back to our opponent's hand to make it so that they have 1 more card in hand to make our card destruction even more devastating. This doesn't come up much, because generally you're just trying to use what you have on hand to stall until the end of the game. But if it does come up, it's very funny. So that's a good thing to consider. Of course, these monsters we're trying to bring out mainly with Ultimate Offering, so that way they dodge our opponent's removal. Ultimate Offering is actually something to watch over the course of the game, because that 500 points of damage that you pay every time you activate it can actually add up. So you can actually get pretty low on life points over the course of a game. So you always have to keep that in mind, especially when considering when to use Wobokus to block damage. But we'll get to that later. Let's talk about the spells. 3 card destructions. These are basically the final game plan of the deck. These are the way you close out the games, because you can use them partway through if you have a particularly bad hand that doesn't really do much, and you really want to draw deeper into your deck to draw the pieces that you need to stall your opponent for longer. But it can just be incredibly devastating if your opponent is down to like 10 cards and they have 4 cards in hand, and you just activate 3 card destructions in rapid succession, and you deplete them of their entire deck, and you cause them to deck out. So this is the way we're mainly closing out games, although it can also be used if you're playing against an Exodia deck. So it's kind of funny that in the stall matchup, generally the card destruction deck does beat the Exodia deck. But moving on to our other spells, we have, of course, our classic Speed of Removal with 3 Dark Hold, 3 Raigekis. We also have the space in this deck to include 3 Fissures, which can also be a very powerful removal tool. And we also have 3 Pot of Greeds. Now, you could argue that the Pot of Greeds are actually detrimental to our game plan because they get us closer to deck out. But I think that given that you're the one playing the card destructions most of the time, you can use the cards that you draw with Pot of Greed in a way to deplete your hand anyways, to not have the risk of yourself decking out through your own card destructions. It is a bit of a tricky thing to do, and it does take some level of skill to keep track of all that, which I think makes this deck a bit harder to play than the Exodia style deck. But I think that Pot of Greed is definitely worth having because just being able to see more of your cards, having more answers to your opponent's offensive pushes is very, very good, even though it does deplete your deck a bit. We, of course, also have the 3 Swords of Revealing Light, Premier Stall Tool. Even if D-Spells in the format, you still got to run 3 of these just to have the potential to stall your opponent for 3 more turns. Moving on to the traps, we have 3 Trap Holes. Great at removing Wicked Worm Beasts especially, but pretty much any threat that your opponent would normal summon out. We have 3 Ultimate Offerings, which I talked about before. And I want to mention here that we're playing all 3 because we definitely want to see this card, but we don't even really care if we draw duplicates because we can just use that as fodder for card destruction to potentially draw into better stuff. As I said, in general, you do want to save the card destructions for the end of the game, but having Ultimate Offering as discard fodder for when you do really need to dig deeper into your deck for answers to your opponent's offensive moves can be very helpful. So we don't really care if we draw duplicates of this. And of course, we have 3 Woboku for the premier stalling tool in the format. Now, I want to mention something before I go into the side deck, and something that you might have noticed is that this deck is playing 42 cards, which is different from all the other decks that I've shown, which always have a hard cap of 40. The reason for this is because we want to maximize the chances of us not decking out. We want to maximize the chances of our opponent being lower in cards than us at all times. And so that's why we have 42 cards. In addition, we don't really need the extra consistency that having 40 cards will give us, because in a worst case scenario, we can always card destruction to draw deeper into our deck. And also we have a lot of redundant cards in all the defenders that we have. So we don't really need to draw any of the specific defenders. The main things we need to draw are like Ultimate Offering and Wobokus and Swords. But like beyond that, as long as we draw those, we're fine. And having 42 cards does decrease the likelihood slightly of that happening, but that's why we're playing 3 of each of them. So I think 42 cards is the way to go for this sort of deck. Although if you're confident enough in your ability to manage your resources so that you won't deck out, you can go down to 40. Just be warned that you will probably lose in a mirror match if you do play someone else playing Stall Mill. Although, if they're also playing 42 cards, that might happen anyways. So, something to keep in mind. For the side deck, you can side into something like Exodia, because it's unlikely that your opponent will side in a card destruction in game 2 against this, and that would let you keep all the defensive tools that you have in the deck. However, siding into Exodia in a 42 card deck is probably not the best option, as it just decreases your chances of drawing Exodia, and your opponent is likely going to side into dispels or reinforcements or things that can get over your defenders and stallers. So I don't think that the smokescreen side into Exodia is actually a good option. I think the much better option is a smokescreen side into Aggro. So we have just a standard smokescreen side into Aggro here. I talked about this in the Exodia section of this guide, and I think that the same principles hold true here, where we play Change of Hearts instead of Monster Reborns because our opponent's likely to side out of trap holes. And especially in this deck, I don't think that they're likely to side into card destructions. So your Wicked Worm Beasts are very, very likely to survive, and we really don't need to add any Monster Reborns. Change of Hearts lets us put on more offensive pressure than Monster Reborn would otherwise. I do think that this is a bit of a better smokescreen than Exodia is, mainly because we can side out a lot of our weak defenders that we would otherwise keep, and we can basically turn this into a worm reaction sort of deck. And since worm reaction sorts of decks can actually have a very good matchup against the sort of uber aggressive aggro decks that many aggro decks will side into after seeing this sort of deck on the first game, I think that this smokescreen strategy can be pretty good. I will say, as a word of warning, 42 cards can make this aggro strategy a bit less consistent than it would otherwise be, but I think that adding just 2 cards doesn't really affect that much. So I think that generally you can have a pretty good aggro deck in games 2 and 3, and that can easily close out the match. So why do I think that this deck is a bit worse than the Exodia deck if I think that it has a better smokescreen? Well, I think that this deck is a bit worse, partly because it's so hard to play. There are a lot of things that you have to keep track of over the course of the game, and there's a lot of resource management that you don't have to deal with in other decks. I also think that your opponent can play against this sort of strategy more easily than they can against Exodia, since a big portion of what you're trying to do depends largely on how many cards are in their hand. So if they manage to play a lot of the cards from their hand and keep their hand size pretty small, you're a lot less able to manage to deplete all their resources at the end of the game. So I think because it's harder to play, it's harder to actually win with, given that your opponent can play around it more easily. I think that game 1, this thing is a lot less likely to win than Exodia is. Even though if it does win game 1, I think that it's a lot more likely to win games 2 and 3 than Exodia would be in the same position. So that's why I think it's slightly worse than Exodia, but I do think that it is still a pretty good deck, and it's a deck that is very, very formidable because it's just miserable to play against. I mean, there are very few words to describe the misery of playing a very, very long game against this deck, because games against this deck will go very, very long unless you manage to just push through all your aggressive pushes and just deplete their life points before they can really get their stall tools up. That being said, I am very glad that there is another direction for stall players to go in this format, and I do think this is a really cool idea for a deck, even though in practice it is very degenerate. That's the last of the decks I really wanted to talk about for this format guide. I will again, just like last format, be showcasing a bunch of duels between these sorts of decks and just showing how to play given matchups. And so I hope that you stick around for those. But before I finish the video, I want to dive into the miscellaneous cards that didn't really fit in any of the other discussions, but are still interesting enough for me to want to talk about. So before finishing off this format guide, I want to talk about the cards that aren't very good, but are still interesting. You know, I wouldn't recommend that any deck play these, but I still think they're cool to talk about. So let's dive in right with the monsters, the first of which is the Stern Mystic. The Stern Mystic is a flip effect monster that reveals all face down cards on the field and return them to their original positions. This is an interesting effect, especially with regards to things like Dispel and Trapmaster being in the format. Stern Mystic can sniff out your opponent's bluffs and allow you to dispel a powerful spell that they set with very high confidence. It can also let you see a set monster that your opponent has that you're maybe worried about attacking. The only problem with Stern Mystic is that it just takes a bit too much setup for not enough payoff. You have to first set this card face down and then flip it face up. And you've got to count on the fact that if your opponent flips it face up, they're not just going to use up a spell card that they have set to dodge Dispel. In the case of monsters, it's even worse because likely a monster that your opponent has set, if it's a flip effect monster, they'll just flip it up on their turn. If it's a Mania Bug, they can destroy your Stern Mystic without you getting any information. If it's a Trapmaster, they can hit a card. You know, it's just, your Stern Mystic will be useless at that point because the monster is now flipped up. So, I don't think Stern Mystic's very good. And even if it could reveal all face down cards without requiring a turn of setup, I don't think it would even be worth playing for the payoff of increasing the accuracy of your bluff snipes with Dispel. I just don't think it's worth it. So it's an interesting card, just doesn't cut the mustard, unfortunately. Moving on to the spells, we first have Ancient Telescope. Ancient Telescope says, see the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck and return the cards to the deck in the same order. This can be good for just knowing what your opponent is going to get in the coming turns and being able to adjust your strategy to best compensate for that. However, this card doesn't actually do anything to stop the cards your opponent's drawing. It just lets you know about them. So, as opposed to playing this, you could just play a card that could deal with whatever your opponent brings out, because that's a bit more valuable than the knowledge of what your opponent's going to get. So I don't think Ancient Telescope is very good. The Inexperienced Spy suffers from similar problems. The Inexperienced Spy says, select and see 1 card in your opponent's hand. Now, this could let you know what your opponent's got in your hand, unlike Ancient Telescope, which is decent, I guess. You can play around that specific card that they have, I guess. But you don't learn what else is in their hand. And also, again, just like Ancient Telescope, this doesn't actually deal with the card in their hand. It just lets you know what it is. So, this card is much, much worse than Ancient Telescope in my opinion. But they're both pretty bad for very, very similar reasons. Diving into the trap cards, we have Reverse Trap, which initially reads like it actually would be a decent card to include. Reverse Trap says, until the end phase, all effects that add or subtract attack or defense are reversed. Basically what this means is that, you know, if your opponent has a Lodgin and they've used reinforcements on it, then Reverse Trap decreases Lodgin's attack by 500. So it drops its attack down to 1300 instead of what it normally would be at 2300 attack. This may seem like a perfect counter to reinforcements and something that most decks should play if they're worried about that. The issue is that unlike reinforcements and Castle Walls, it doesn't directly modify the attack and defense of a monster. It affects all effects that modify the attack and defense of a monster. So you can't actually activate Reverse Trap in the damage step, meaning that you'd have to activate it before the damage step, which means your opponent would know about it and thus not activate their reinforcements. So This card can be used to preemptively stop your opponent from using reinforcements, and it can also be used against tribal strategies that can't activate their effects during the damage step but must activate them beforehand. However, it just isn't quite good enough to see play because against reinforcements, your opponent can just save the reinforcement for later, and tribal strategies aren't common enough to actually merit the inclusion of this card. Still an interesting card, though. Now I want to talk about some cards that are not new in this format, but have interesting applications that they didn't in the last format. The main one I want to talk about is Gravedigger's Ghoul. Now, I mentioned Gravedigger's Ghoul last time as sort of a way to get your opponent's Monster Reborn targets out of the graveyard to prevent them from bringing back a big threat. Gravedigger's Ghoul in this format has a bit of a better target, however, in the form of Wicked Wormbeast. One of the biggest flaws of it in the last format is that any Monster Reborn target you remove from the graveyard, you could have just used Monster Reborn on instead and had a good monster on the field. Here, if you try to Monster Reborn a Wicked Wormbeast, then that Wicked Wormbeast will return to your opponent's hand if it's the opponent's card to begin with. So Gravedigger Ghoul actually has a decent application in getting rid of your opponent's Wicked Wormbeast so they can't bring them back with Monster Reborn. However, since it's a spell, you can't actually activate it during your opponent's turn. And often, if you manage to destroy a Wicked Wormbeast with something like Trap Hole, your opponent will have a backup Monster Reborn in their hand that they can activate immediately bringing back the Wicked Wormbeast and preventing you from being able to use Gravedigger Ghoul profitably. This card maybe could see some play in the Stall Mill strategy, because if you activate card destruction and send to the graveyard your opponent's Wicked Wormbeasts, then Gravedigger Ghoul can banish them before they can actually manage to Monster Reborn them back. However, I just don't think the card is good enough. It's just a bit too niche to actually be good in this format. It is interesting to talk about, though. Two-pronged attack gets a little bit better in this format because you're more easily able to get two monsters onto the field with something like Ultimate Offering, which lets you perform extra normal summons. However, the issue with two-pronged attack was never in how easy it was to activate. The issue was always in how resource intensive it is, using up 3 cards to destroy only one of your opponents. So it just frankly isn't good enough, and I don't think it will ever be good, honestly. It's just a bad card. Lastly, I want to talk about a card that doesn't really have interesting applications in this format, but is more a casualty of this format, and that's Armed Ninja. I mentioned this before when discussing the core cards, that Dispel basically just power creeps Armed Ninja out of the game completely, and that is very much true. This is actually slightly shocking given how good Armed Ninja was in the last format, being the only way to remove Swords Revealing Light and being able to pop your opponent's bluffs, which is a relatively frequent occurrence given that there was only one reasonable trap hole to play in the last format. This format, however, there are many good trap cards to play, and Dispel is just better at clearing swords or any spell card because it can be used without having to set it first. So Armed Ninja has just lost all purpose. And that's really wild to see the power creep in the game happen so early to such a prominent card. But it's also a really cool feature of this game in that cards that were really good in one format can just be absolutely terrible in the next. And I think it's really interesting to see that happen in real time. But that's the last of the sort of miscellaneous cards I wanted to discuss. Now let's dive right into my final thoughts on the format. I actually think this format is really cool. Of course, many people might not enjoy it because it's really determined by the Raigekis and Dark Holes and other just broken removal spells that you draw over the course of the game, and it has incredibly powerful defensive tools like Waboku and Ultimate Offering as well, which can make games really just slow down to a crawl and make them last a very long time. However, I still think this is a lot more interesting of a format than last format. Last format was essentially dominated by Exodia, and there were no real good counter strategies to that deck. This format, however, I think is more dominated by the Wicked Wormbeast decks, which feel more interactive to play against because they're aggro-based. Sure, there's not really any good way to get rid of the Wicked Wormbeast besides like Trap Hole or a Maneater Bug that you somehow manage to get off. But you know that Wicked Wormbeast is in your opponent's hand, you know that Wicked Wormbeast is a threat, and you can try and play around that sort of thing. So I think there is a lot more interactivity, even with the sort of best strategies in the format. I also think it's really cool to see a card like Wicked Wormbeast get to shine, because Wicked Wormbeast has long been looked at as sort of a just terrible card, because its effect just seems like a pure downside. However, in this format, it becomes a major upside, which sort of shows how just different cards can really shine depending on what the other cards that are good in the format are. Because Wicked Wormbeast would be nowhere near as good if there wasn't so much access to free removal and things like Raigeki and Dark Hole. I think that makes this format a lot more complex than the previous format and a lot more fun to play. Like, I actually enjoy playing the Wicked Wormbeast decks in this format because there's a lot of decisions to make at different points in the game. And I like the sort of resource conservation strategy that Wicked Wormbeast enables. However, before ending the guide in this format, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this format is incredibly different from how it was meant to be played. Again, just like last format, I don't think that the people at Konami actually expected people to look into this card game as an actual competitive sort of thing. And so they didn't have a limited list up when these cards were first released because I don't even think they had tournaments. And I think they mainly just expected kids to buy the sets and play the game just like their anime characters, right? You had Yugi with Dark Magician, and if kids liked Yugi, they could get that deck. And you had Kaiba with Blue Eyes White Dragon. If you like Kaiba, you could get that deck. And sure, each deck has its own sort of powerful cards. Starter Deck Kaiba had La Jin, whereas Starter Deck Yugi had both Summon Skull and Change of Heart, which made for an incredibly powerful combo, taking your opponent's monster and summoning it for a Summon Skull. I think that generally people thought that kids would just buy one starter deck each and just play starter deck versus starter deck against their friends, maybe add in some of the cards that they got from the Legend of Blue Eyes booster set, to spice things up a bit. I don't think that they ever anticipated a sort of deep dive into the format that revealed Wicked Wormbeast to be the best strategy. But that's part of the fun of playing this game, is that you can play in a very sort of casual way, just living it out like the anime duels, or you can go really hard in it and just sort of dive deep into the format and really dig into the card pool to uncover crazy strategies that are actually very dominant. So I really like this format. I will say maybe this is just in comparison to LOB format, which was really, really rough, but I think this format is decently fun. Although I think it's probably nowhere near as good as the next format, which is Yugi Kaiba format, which is an incredibly popular format in some circles. And I'm excited to dive into that eventually. But first, we're going to have some matchups featured between these different sorts of SDYK decks, and just to show off some of the gameplay, show off what some decks do well and other decks do poorly, and to show off just how to play these decks, because some of them are actually pretty counterintuitive. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I know it's another long one, although not quite as long as LOB format. but it's a big time commitment to watch. So thank you for sticking all the way through to the end. And if you have any suggestions for me to improve these sorts of videos, if you want to see these guides broken up into multiple videos in the future, please let me know in the comments below. And if you want to stay up to date on the videos I'll be releasing featuring the different deck matchups in this format, then feel free to subscribe and you'll be notified whenever those videos come out. Until next time, I've been Ben with YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.